Hey there! Today on Behind Closed Doors, we're going back to the 90s with a classic monopose Bretonnian Archer. Our first base coat here is Khorne Red over a Chaos Black undercoat. When doing any kind of patterns or heraldry on models, I think it's always good to start with the lighter colour, so you can then fix any mistakes when you base coat with the darker colour afterwards. I'm using a wet palette here, just to keep the paint really thin, which is always the way to go when using lots of layers. You want to keep moving your brush and don't go over any areas twice while the paint's drying. You don't need to worry too much about coverage because we're going to be doing 2 coats of all these base colours just for a nice even finish. Now I'm coming back with Kantor Blue for the darker part of the uniform, and this is such a lovely rich navy blue. In fact, the old version of this paint was called Regal Blue, which I think is perhaps more fitting. Although, I am a fan of Crimson Fists, so Kantor Blue, not too bad really. These Bretonnian models will always hold a special place in my heart because these guys came with the 5th edition Warhammer Fantasy box, and it was the first big box I got in the 90s when I was, just starting my foray into the hobby. I'll never forget opening up for Christmas and seeing all the sprues and the books and the bits and pieces. It was like a whole new world with endless possibilities, and I think some people out there will be in the same boat with these guys. His hood and leggings are going to be Skaven Blight Dinge because a grey colour for these is going to work well with the other 2 bold colours, and I'm trying to keep this miniature with a kind of original look from the time, mixed with my own little ideas, so we're going for that classic blue, red, grey look. There were actually 2 variations of box art for these models during the time they were available, and the first one had a blue and yellow colour scheme for the archers, and I was originally going to do that, but I've done a few videos with yellow recently, so I decided to go with the blue and red, and I kind of like it more anyway. It's got that bold medieval look to it. Time for the skin base coat with Cadian Flesh Tone. Always make sure you have this nice and thin on the palette before applying it because the face, more than any other part of the model, it's an area you really don't want to be filling in any detail, especially on old plastics like this, which don't start with the best details anyway. So keep it thin, and don't forget his little hands there too. Everything that's not going to be metal can be painted with Rhinox hide, just to keep things simple. Now, Rhinox hide's a great base for a lot of different browns, and even though I'm going to be keeping everything the same to get this model done in a bold and simple way, you could go in a few different directions from this base colour. I like to keep the colour palette small on rank and file miniatures like this. We aren't doing a display model here, so Rhinox hide for the leather and bits as well as the wood works just fine for me. The last base coat here is Iron Warriors, which is a wonderfully dark silver, and my go-to for true metallic base coats. You could definitely go lighter than this with something like Lead Belcher or Ironbreaker. It all just depends on the style you're after. I like to make the bold uniform colours and clothing on these types of models stand out, so I tend to go quite dark with the secondary colours, just so there's no conflict for the eye there. Nuln Oil over the whole model will quickly provide some shade for all the colours, while also tying everything together tonally. And this is my go-to wash for models because it's the most flexible over a variety of different colours, which is important when you're trying to paint a bunch of these guys for an army. And it also complements the black lining style well, which I'm a big fan of, and will be appropriate given this is an older model too. Make sure the wash is completely dry before coming back to do all these base layers, and we're starting with Khorne Red. We're just essentially taking each of our previous base coats and using it now as the first highlight layer, while leaving all the shade in the recesses. This is going to neaten up all the colours where the wash has darkened areas we don't want it, and it's also going to bring some of the saturation back in these colours. You don't necessarily need 2 coats with any of these base layers because we're doing more coats on top, but go over anything again if it looks particularly patchy. Kantor Blue is next on the list here. We're also paying attention in this phase of the process for any areas which might need a bit more shade or blackline, and then you can just quickly add that in as you go along with some wash or maybe a little bit of black mixed with wash if you want to make it a bit darker. as well as any mistakes we might want to fix. We can just attend to all that now before we get into the serious highlighting. Skaven Blight Dinge, great colour. Be careful here when doing these details close to the face. We don't want to have to do any touch-ups from now on, particularly on areas like that. And for smaller secondary areas like this, you can sometimes as well just skip this base layer step and go straight to the 50/50 highlight, which we're going to be looking at after this. It all just depends on your own style and how fast you want to get these models out to the table and the size of the area you're painting as well. And finally, hit all the other details with some Rhinox hide. As I mentioned before, for dark secondary colours like this, you can probably just skip this step entirely, but the wash does settle a bit on areas like the bow, which do have a slightly larger surface area, so I always like to go through this process for all the base layers. Now, I like to do the eyes early on so I can adjust them before doing the face highlights. That's going to be particularly important with an older model like this because the details weren't the crispest, so we're almost freehanding the eyes on here a little. He's looking quite ridiculous right now with the eyes, but we're just going to keep adjusting the eyes with white and black until we're happy. If you have a bit of trouble with eyes, it can also be good to paint the pupil as just a vertical black line going from the top to the bottom, and then adjust the skin around it. If you make the pupil too big, you can also add some white spots on either sides. There's a lot of back and forth with painting eyes to get them just right. Then once you're happy with the structure of the eye, we're going to go and use the flesh tone to fix them up further. And you can see by doing the eyes like this before the facial highlights, it's just a much less stressful experience. You can take your time, getting them just right. So just remember to keep your paint thin for this, so there's no build up around these important details. I'm such a fan of these older models, not just because of the nostalgia, but because they have a wonderful simplicity to them and they nail what they're going after visually in a perfect way. There's no confusion about what this is. It's a medieval dude with a bow, and I love it. Now we're getting further into the layers with a 50/50 Khorne Red Mephiston Red mix, and these are just thin layers to create a bit of blending between the shades. Depending on how much time you want to spend on your minis, you can do more or less blends in this stage. I think one 50/50 mix between two different reds, it's usually enough for tabletop standard, but you can adjust this further for character models or display stuff, for example. And to finish off the red layers, we're coming back with pure Mephiston Red, and this is still a fairly heavy highlight because we're going to be doing some edge highlighting later. And don't forget, when I say heavy, I'm just talking about the distribution of the paint on the model, not how watered down it is, because you always want nice thin paint when you're working with layers. And we're going to be following the same process on all the other colours now. This is Kantor Blue and Kalador Sky mix here. Again, trying not to disrupt the shading we've already achieved on the model so far. Final pass on the blue layers here with pure Kalador Sky to really bring out that rich colour. On models like this, which lack a bit of detail, you can really add some more dimensions with these layers and mark in shadows and highlights where it's fairly flat on the model. And as you get more experience with miniature painting, you'll kind of work out yourself where to put these light parts and dark parts if the detail's not really defined on models to kind of recreate that 3D effect. And for the grey areas, we've got a mix of Skaven Blight Dinge and Dawnstone happening, just blending up from the base, same as with the other colours. This is also the stage in the model where mistakes in previous steps can be discovered, and that's just one of the great things about using a wet palette. All your previous colours and shades, they're there, they're ready to go, so it's an easy fix. Just whack on your base coat, whack on the next one up, and you'll be back to where we were. A few little highlight layers with Dawnstone, just to finish off this stage of the clothing, and then we're going to get on with the face and final highlights. For the face highlights, I'm going straight to Kislev Flesh here, because the face and hands are such small areas of the model, you don't necessarily need to do as many transitional layers. Also, because of the sculpted detail in faces, I think they actually look better on the tabletop with some more stark highlights. I've mixed a bit of white with the Kislev flesh for some final extreme highlights, just concentrated on areas like the nose and the fingers to really accentuate these focal points and create some nice contrast. For areas like this, you can really go to town with the highlights and, make them even brighter, just depends on what you're going for. After we're happy here, the face will be done and we can move on to the final highlights. I'm applying some final edge highlights to key points on the model, starting with a Mephiston red and Ural yellow mix. Sometimes I prefer to mix white with red for these kinds of highlights, but I thought a more orangey highlight would work better here with what I'm going for, just with the overall look of the Mini, keeping it kind of a bit old school looking. You could also just use an orange from your paint collection here, but I like to mix paints because, it's good practice and it's definitely going to keep that color in the same tone by doing this. You can also adjust your highlight color when you mix to get it perfect. Now onto the blue highlights, with a bit of white mixed in to our Calidor sky. Something like Lothern Blue would also work fine for this purpose, and using colours which are the next shade up or next 2 shades up can save you time when you're painting in bulk. Administratum Grey is being used for all the edge highlights on the grey. And as I previously mentioned, if you don't have any of these colours, all these edge highlights can be mixed from your layer colours, because these highlights are just on a very tiny part of the model, and small variations in your mixes won't be noticeable across a whole bunch of models. Highlighting the wood and leather bits now. And I like to think that all these final highlights are kind of optional really. You can do more or less depending on the standard you're going for. For models used on the tabletop, I think one final extreme highlight like this on everything, it's more than enough, but if you were painting a lot of models, you could skip this step entirely and maybe come back later and apply some highlights once you get the rest of the army done. I generally use a matte varnish for my miniatures, and that's going to dull metal areas like this, so I often like to come back once everything's done and give a light dry brush on the metal areas just to bring back a little bit of shine. In any case though, a highlight of a lighter silver can really brighten up the metal and tie it with the highlight style of the rest of the model, even though it's not always necessary with true metallic metal. We're all done with the model, but I just had to give him a classic green base to really take him back to the 90s. There's a few different variations of Goblin Green on the market from a variety of different brands, and I did test out a couple, but in the end, I just preferred the tone of Warboss Green, which, while a little different to the original Goblin Green, it is Citadel's successor to the colour. I'm keeping this quite thin and doing a few coats so I don't clog up the sand on the base too much. The sand, incidentally, it's just glued on with PVA and then another watered down coat of PVA is added over the top. It's just the tried and true method of basing. A dry brush of green mixed with some bone will pick out that grass texture and just finish off the model nicely. The archer is complete, ready to go fight for his Lord of the Realm in the fair lands of Bretonnia. These old school models take me back to a simpler time, and they're such a joy to paint because of this. Perhaps this video inspired you to bring out some of your old models and do some refurbishments, or just have a look at them and see how far you've come. I certainly hope so. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Behind Closed Doors.